Jarrell co-hosting with me. And we have a wonderful guest. And Jason, I'll probably read your bio as well. But I want to introduce our special guest tonight, which is Jeff Wilson. And Jeffrey Wilson is MSc Director and co-founder of the Independent Crop Circle Researchers Association, ICCRA, has been investigating crop circles that have been reported in the United States since 1996 and has visited well over 100 during the last 12 years. He was an early member of the Center for Crop Circle Studies at CCCS in both the UK and USA branches before both organizations went defunct. He has been a contributor of USA Crop Circle reports to the Crop Circle Connector website since 1996. He was a frequent contributor to Crop Circle News until that website closed. His crop circle research has been covered by numerous newspapers across the USA. He is frequently interviewed on Linda Howe's Earth Files website. He's been a guest on various national and local TV networks, as well as national and local radio programs, including Coast to Coast AM with George Norrie. Wilson received a master's degree in general science from Eastern Michigan University, where he taught physics, astronomy classes, and helps operate and maintain Sherzer Observatory on a volunteer basis. He has also designed and taught on an online astronomy class for the OMNIBUS master's degree program at Schoolcraft College, jointly with Madonna University in Livonia, Michigan. He was a 6-time certified Skywarn severe spotter for the Washtenaw County Emergency Management Division and the National Weather Service while he lived in that county. And from 1997 to 2000, he has served on an environmental task force for Representative Lynn N. 13th District, United States House of Representatives. He's a past member of both the American Geophysical Union and Michigan Academy of Science, Arts, and Letters, where he has presented at their annual conferences. It's fantastic. Wilson wanted to write his master's thesis on crop circles, but couldn't get any academics to sponsor it. Instead, he received a grant for his thesis from NASA under the Michigan Space Grant Consortium to analyze and map geologic reflectivity data from NASA's Lunar Prospector mission. Wilson now works as an analyst in private industry. And Wilson currently serves as a volunteer board member of the Friends of the Serpent Mound as the Director of Special Events and Projects. He is also a contributing member of the Hanwauken Center for Prehistoric Astronomy, Cosmology, and Landscape Studies, a certified volunteer for the Ohio Historical Society, and a member of the Serpent Mound chapter of the American Society of Dowsers. He is enthusiastically and happily married to Delphi Wilson. What an incredible bio. You can contact him at jeff.wilson@iccra.org. And we want to please welcome Jeff to the show this evening, and also Jason. Good evening, gentlemen.
Good evening.
Hello.
Hi. It's wonderful to hear both your voices here. And, of course, Jason, I know you and Jeff have been friends for a while, so obviously you appreciate his research. Anything you'd like to add here?
I just wanted to say, ladies and gentlemen, tonight we are speaking to a true researcher who has spent many years of his life scientifically investigating the crop circle phenomenon. I have known Jeff Wilson for a few years now, and he has my respect as a scholar, and it's an honor and a pleasure to be doing this show with him. How are you doing, Jeff?
Really good. I appreciate that. You really did your homework on that intro. Yeah, you didn't have to go into all that stuff.
Hey, you have a stellar bio. There's no doubt about that. So I'm going to ask you a very generic question, but I have to ask it anyway. So what attracted you to crop circles? How did you get involved in all that?
That's a story from a long time ago. Back in 1988, my younger brother and I caught a short news segment on television that was interviewing a guy over in England that had been looking at crop circles for a few years. His name is Dr. George Terence Meaden. And Dr. Meaden, who was an atmospheric physicist, was probably the first in the modern era to look at crop circles as kind of a weather phenomenon or a natural phenomenon. And I thought the TV segment was really interesting and kind of filed that in the back of my mind, like, wow, I think I want to know more about that. And I was just entering college at that point and got the chance to, through interlibrary loan, go and get a bunch of British journals that Meaden had written little articles about finding crop circles here and there in England. And that's kind of how I got interested in it.
That's fascinating. Well, I'll tell you what, like I said, you have an impressive bio, and I think between you and Jason, you make an excellent combination insofar as your expertise goes in both areas, and especially with Jason and the mounds. And I'd like to ask you also, how do you personally define a crop circle?
Well, I mean, if you just start trying to find a definition for one, I would say that crop circles at their most basic level would just be considered swirled and flattened areas or patterns found primarily in agricultural fields. That's probably the simplest, most straightforward definition of them.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that sounds good enough. And Jason, chime in anytime you want to.
Well, my question is actually very similar to that, but I just want to ask Jeff on a deep level, what are crop circles?
Yeah, that's the $1 million question, isn't it? Well, beyond just the straightforward definition that's there, from a deeper, more fundamental idea about what are they, or why are they appearing, or what does it mean, I think you have to think about it in the way in which we actually think about anything, that we study, scientifically. For the most part, you have to go back to probably Thomas Kuhn from Harvard University in his book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, that he wrote back in the early 60s. He, in that book, introduced the term paradigm and paradigm shift. You might be familiar with those terms. Either one of you ever heard those terms before?
Yes.
Most people don't really understand what they mean or what Thomas Kuhn coined them to mean, but they were coined to describe ways of viewing knowledge, both within and beyond the field of science. Basically, what Kuhn was getting at was, no matter what you are attempting to study, the discipline that, of people that look at whatever it is that you're going to study, they agree upon certain rules. And that sort of rule set is a paradigm. And over time, those rule sets and the ways in which you view knowledge can shift. And that's what a paradigm shift is. Well, back in the early 1990s, there was a graduate student at Princeton by the name of Michael Korost, who wrote a thesis paper on crop circles. It was called Thesis for a Pre-Paradigm Science. Seriology is what he called the study of crop circles. And he argued that that crop circles as a phenomenon, as a scientific thing to study, was so new that the rules hadn't been written yet. And so he was arguing that we needed to figure out a new way of thinking, a new way of defining what crop circles really were, because they didn't really fit into anything that science had come up with previously. Thinking about that over time, over a long period of time, and studying crop circles as long as I have, I'm beginning to suspect that crop circles may be something that are without paradigm. And that is very difficult for people to wrap their heads around. How can you not define what they are? But even from a scientific standpoint, they seem to almost defy whatever rule set or boundary conditions you try to place upon them. And so crop circles are, in the study of them, are extraordinarily complex. And I would say that there are so many surprising things about them, and the depth of your studies, can take you to places that you would have never imagined.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense. I know you say in 95% of all the crop circles in the United States, they have 3 criteria. Would you like to run that by us?
Sure. I think you're talking about, generally speaking, what we found as is that crop circles really don't appear anywhere in the landscape. They have certain contextual criteria that we have found that repeat over and over again. So crop circles generally appear on the downslope or at the very bottom of a hill or the lowest part of a field. They almost never appear at the top of a hill or, on higher elevations. Mm-hmm. They also appear in very close proximity to some kind of body of water, a creek, a pond, a drainage ditch, over the top of an aquifer, that kind of thing. The third criteria that we have found in crop circles that I should have prefaced this, that are not man-made, is that they appear really close to power lines. And in about 85% of those cases, the power lines, wherever the pole closest to the crop circle is, has a transformer box on it. Not all power line poles have that. So we generally see those three criteria in more than 95% of the non-man-made crop circles that we've investigated. Mm-hmm. Now there is another contextual clue that appears pretty often, and that is crop circles come down in very close proximity to ancient archaeological sites and mound sites here in the United States.
That's fascinating.
About 65% of the time. Mm-hmm. We think that number is probably higher because so many earthworks have been obliterated that not a lot of records exist of where all of them were. So
right. You have any comments?
Jeffrey,
go ahead.
Yes, Jeff mentioned that the crop circle phenomenon may be without paradigm, but Jeff, in your research, have you been able to detect certain patterns of behavior that seem to recur in the crop circle landscape?
What do you mean by behavior?
Are there certain recurring scenarios with the crop circles? Can they be seen to be connected with one another in any way?
Yes, in a certain way. I would say that one of the fairly unknown or very little known aspects to crop circles that I have found in my research over time. A few years ago gave some public presentations about this particular aspect. I'd say around 2005, 2006, I began a project to map the locations of all the crop circles in the United States. And as a part of that process, one of the things that we found was that in certain seasons of crop circles, that you would find a handful of them that would align to one another across the landscape. So you might have, anywhere from 3 to 5 crop circles stretched out over a couple of 100 miles that all would line up if you plotted them on a map. And so that sort of idea of alignments of crop circles was new. People hadn't really recognized that before. And that observation was helped out by the advent of mapping technology. So once the democratization of mapping tools, got filtered out to people, that's when we really began to understand and map them very well. Later on, when Google Earth, was released, you were able to then go even farther. We were, instead of just placing dots on the map, I could actually take aerial photographs of the crop circles and import them directly into the maps and get them in their correct orientation in the landscape. which no one had really done before. And from that, we made another really interesting key observation, and that was crop circles that had some kind of straight line flattened area as a part of their overall design. It was kind of a straight line component of the overall geometry of the crop circle. If you extended that straight line across the landscape beyond the boundaries of the crop circle, they would point right to another crop circle that appeared in the landscape. And in many cases, they would go like right to the centers of other crop circles, or down another straight line geometric component of this, a secondary crop circle. And we're talking about, anywhere from 30 miles away to 2,000 miles away. They would point to other crop circles. And here's the really amazing part of it. Because I was working with a historical database and mapping crop circles over, a 50, 60-year period, we were able to see where crop circles pointed to other crop circles in the past, but also where crop circles were pointing to crop circles that had not yet occurred, the crop circles in the future. And so we were able to see that perhaps you could use that database as sort of a diagnostic tool to understand, was this a legit crop circle or not? Or, fundamentally, that brings up, some really interesting questions about the true nature of crop circles, which most people haven't really considered. And the only reason that we, even had a glimmer of understanding of any of it was because of, the advent of new technological breakthroughs that helped us understand to a new level what they were.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's fascinating. The crop circles almost appear as markers on the map to me, and it seems like what you're describing is almost like an interdimensional highway, that they're all interconnected to some degree. It's like they're building a network. It's under intelligent control. I know I'm looking at this on a very different level, but it just seems very, very fascinating to me the way you're describing it.
Mm-hmm.
Jeff, do you believe that one reason that we do not have a paradigm that can explain the crop circles could be because of our limited position in time?
Possibly. I think it has more to do, though, probably with the limitations in Western philosophy. more likely. If you think about, sort of the fundamental ways in which Western civilization thinks about things, it's generally binary opposition, right? It's either this or that. If you look at, for instance, a lot of media coverage about crop circles, like you look at the headlines when a crop circle is reported, for instance, they'll say it's either a hoax or it's a UFO that made it. There aren't any other possibilities. But there are other possibilities, right? There's a fairly famous French philosopher who talked about this problem. Jacques Derrida was his name. And he threw in a different kind of philosophical concept to understand this, and he called it undecidability. And undecidability was considered to be a threat to the traditional foundations of Western philosophy. He gives a very fun sort of example of this about like the zombie. The zombie is a concept that comes out of the Caribbean cultures, but the zombie is both dead and alive, or it's neither dead nor alive, right? But in Western civilization or Western rationalism, you are either dead or you're alive. You can't be both. And so zombies is an example of undecidability. They occupy the space in between, right? So undecidables are threatening because in Western civilization, we live in a world of decidable categories. So crop circles, they don't fit into binary opposition because they're more than what the opposition can allow. Therefore, they actually question the very principle of opposition. So, in a way, crop circles kind of poison the current systems of order. And that's why skeptics have such a violent reaction to crop circles, and why they're so savage in their stubborn insistence that all crop circles are hoaxes, and that's why hoaxers go out there and they continue in their hoaxing efforts, because both the hoaxers and the skeptics, they have this sort of innate need to decide crop circles, which are generally undecidable. Right?
Mm-hmm. Great answer.
Indeed. Jeff, could you describe some of the phenomena that you observe in the field when you encounter a true crop circle?
Right. So, not to just destroy, all scientific principles or anything like that. We actually have a wide scientific protocol that we use when we go out there. I'm all about collecting, just the raw data and the raw facts about things. So when we go out to a crop circle, we will make a whole series of scientific measurements. We will test for radiation. We will make measurements of the local magnetic field, the local electric field, and we will compare those readings from within the crop circle and from out in the field that is largely unaffected at multiple distances away from the circle. And then we will, compare those readings together, and if they're different, then obviously there's something energetically that has happened in there. We'll also make measurements to the plants themselves, because the plants have been affected by whatever energy has made the crop circle. And so what we generally see is in most agricultural plants that are grown in the United States, they're generally grass-type plants. So, wheat, barley, corn, that kind of thing, those are all come from the grass family. Occasionally we see crop circles in soybeans, and those are a bit different because they're like a vine type of a plant. But in the grass-type plants, what we see is that if you look at the stems of those plants, there are what they call growth nodes, which are a bit like the knuckles on your finger. They are staggered up the stalk, and that's where new cells are born, and that's where the stalk, kind of grows from, or those little growth node areas. And what we find inside crop circles is that those growth nodes are dramatically affected by whatever energy has made the crop circle. And what seems to happen, what we think is going on, is that energy heats up the plants very rapidly, and it causes the pressure to build up inside the plant, and it will do one of two things. If the plant is young and still relatively green, then it will stretch out the growth nodes, which are where the new cells are born, and so it's more pliable area of the plant than the rest of the stem. And so it stretches out those growth nodes. Or if the plant is closer to being ready to harvest and it's a little drier or brown, what can happen is the pressure buildup will become so great that it'll blow a hole right out from the inside out in those growth nodes. We call those expulsion cavities. Some people call them blown nodes. And those types of effects, whether it's the node elongation or it's the node expulsion, those are effects that hoaxers cannot duplicate. You can't go around in a field and stomp down plants and cause those effects to happen. Just like walking around in a field, you can't cause radiation to happen. You can't change the electric field. You can't change the magnetic field. So those are the reason why we do those tests, is to be able to discern the difference between crop circles that are man-made and crop circles that aren't man-made.
Very
That's
interesting.
a fair question. things.
Yes, I could just listen to this for hours. This is wonderful. I was going to ask you what the oldest date was insofar as the year these were discovered. Do you have a record of that for crop circles?
Well, there are some people that debate that. There are a handful of European reports that probably date back into the 1500s. A good friend of mine, a fellow researcher in Germany by the name of Andreas Muller, did a pretty sizable study of a number of possible reports throughout Europe, and he came up with, a couple of hundred pretty interesting possibilities. I would say, though, that probably the earliest reports date back into the 1600s that are pretty confirmed. There was a professor at Oxford University, a professor of chemistry by the name of Robert Plot, in the 16th century that reported in an interesting book called The Natural History of Staffordshire, and in that book he reported finding flat and swirled circles in southern England, and he then spent the next 20 years of his life studying them. And so he reported on some of them. And he actually reported on things that, a lot of crop circle researchers don't even believe, existed before the 1980s. But he found crop circles that had geometry, if, for instance. Most people think that only happened after 1990, but he reported on that back in the 1600s. He did the first scientific testing of crop circles, much like I mentioned. He tested the soil conditions inside the crop circle versus outside. He found that it was somewhat drier, inside the circles versus outside. He did, some of the first measuring of circles. He was an interesting character. The earliest records in the United States date back into the 1800s. One of the earliest reports comes from a Bureau of Indian Affairs agent and ethnographer by the name of Henry Schoolcraft, a figure that I'm sure Jason knows very well about. Henry Schoolcraft wrote a report back to Congress in 1847. And in that report, he had a number, it was his duty to basically collect Native American knowledge and traditions, oral stories, mythologies, that kind of thing. And one of his stories that he sent back, which was published, as one of the congressional reports, was called "The Magic Circle in the Prairie." And the story goes: a young hunter found a circular path one day in a prairie without any trail leading to or from it. It was smooth and well beaten and looked as if footsteps had trodden it recently. This puzzled and amazed him. And he goes on to have all kinds of magical adventures after watching this, flattened, swirled circle. It's a tradition which is turned up in a couple of different tribal reports. The name of the hunter sort of changes in the various traditions, but all of the traditions seem to be very similar. So it would indicate that there was a much earlier origin of the story because it was such a widespread myth amongst tribes. So that leads, into some interesting speculation as to, how old could these be. But yeah, they do date back pretty far.
Mm-hmm. It's fascinating. Well, I like your angle of where you come from when you're relaying this data. It's, most of the time people talk about the energetic side to the crop circles, but you have more of a, I like the details that you're presenting to us tonight. It's very interesting to me. So it's like a benchmark. You're giving us a benchmark, and that's really important. So thank you for that.
Oh, you're welcome.
Yeah.
Jeff, you mentioned the geometry of many of the crop circles. Are there any instances of people who have discerned the meaning of the geometry in some of the circles? And what are some of the applications of that, if so?
I'll give you a great, interesting example. There was a crop circle that I studied very intensively that came from where I live now, and that was back in 2003 in Adams County, Ohio, right across the street from the famous Serpent Mound. There was a crop circle that appeared in a soybean field, and it had some intriguing geometry to it. There were 4 circles and 4 crescents. One of the circles had a ring around it, and it was laid out such that the 4 circles and 2 crescents, which made a circle in the center, was kind of laid out a little bit like a Celtic cross design. And a couple of years after that circle came down, I was speaking at a conference in Arizona, and I met another fellow crop circle researcher there by the name of Alan Brown. And Alan Brown over in England had been working with a fairly famous, sacred geometer by the name of John Michell. If you know who John Michell is, New View over Atlantis, the late John Michell. And Michelle was actually also at the conference, and I had some conversations with him too. But what Alan Brown was studying was over in England in the 1980s. I mentioned Dr. George Terence Meaden. Meaden had investigated quite a number, several dozen crop circle formations that were these, what they call the Celtic cross patterns, basically like 5 circles on a dice, laid out in that sort of fashion. And what he found was that they appeared to solve an ancient geometric riddle. Have either of you two ever heard of the phrase, the squaring of the circle?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Okay. Squaring of the circle, basically you construct a square equal in area to a given circle using only a straight edge and a compass. And since the time of the Greeks, in BC times, there have been less than 10 known ways of squaring the circle geometrically with any reasonable accuracy. Let's say 99% or better. But when Alan Brown started to look at these Celtic cross pattern crop circles, he found 50 new ways of being able to square the circle based on that crop circle geometry. They all solved this puzzle. And so I gave him this particular crop circle design from Adams County, Ohio, and he measured that out and was able to find 2 additional ways of being able to square the circle that he hadn't found previously from the ones in England. And just to give you a sense of how accurate they were, what he called a simple square circle solution was 99.58% accurate, and his tangential squared circle solution was 99.9779% accurate. And these are solutions to a geometric riddle that dates back for thousands of years. And for, a couple thousand years, people could only find less than 10 ways to figure out how to solve that puzzle. But looking at crop circle geometry, Alan has been able to find, dozens of new ways of being able to solve that just by examining that geometry. So we've learned new things from looking at crop circles. And that's just one example, but there have been, a couple of other people that have looked at crop circles and learned new geometric theorems based on studying the crop circle geometry that don't appear in like Euclid's theorems of geometry or anything like that. So it's very interesting to be able to find out those, specific details of things that you wouldn't ordinarily even pay any attention to.
Mm-hmm. Very much so.
Jeff, that sounds like people are obtaining new scientific knowledge by studying a phenomenon that isn't even understood.
That's correct, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say that that's, for people that study crop circles over time, what I'll tell you is that no matter what their background is, when they begin to study crop circles, they start to learn new things about their own discipline that they would never have learned if they hadn't started studying crop circles. It's happened so many times. It's almost like a given in the crop circle research community.
It's interesting. Is there any correlation between crop circles and the parallel, insofar as what parallel they might be on? I know sometimes they were associated. I know sometimes they were associated with ley lines. Supposedly that there is a correlation between crop circles and ley lines. What about parallels, like any type of like 33rd parallel or anything weird or a little anomalous?
Well, two things. Trying to unpack your question there a bit. I hear this phrase thrown around a lot that people say that crop circles, have something to do with ley lines. I get that question often, and I always give this answer to that. Have either of you ever heard the name Paul Devereaux?
Sounds familiar.
Paul Devereaux has written dozens of books. Paul Devereaux was the editor of the Lay Hunter Journal for about 20 to 30 years, I think. And he, probably more so than anybody on Earth, studied ley lines, what are ley lines, was the editor of that journal, wrote countless books on ley lines and how to find them and all kinds of stuff. And I always go back to what his definition is that there is no standard definition to what a ley line is.
Interesting.
Nobody can pin it down. Nobody knows exactly what it is or how to explain, it very much. So anybody that says crop circles are associated with them, they don't really understand what a ley line is to even make that claim. And so I try to set that aside for people. Don't just, take that as a given, because first of all, nobody really knows what ley lines are, than to try to make an association with it. Secondly, I'm not exactly sure what you mean by a parallel, but what I can tell you is that crop circles have appeared all over the globe in all kinds of conditions. And whether you're talking about, do they appear at certain latitudes? Does that mean by a parallel?
Well, yeah, that's what I was wondering about. Like, they talk about the 33rd, 44th parallel. If there's some kind of a correlation or signature associated with that. Okay.
I don't think so.
I'm glad you responded to the ley lines, because I've interviewed quite a few people on crop circles, and I have to tell you, most of them do say that. And I think it's so thanks for your rational explanation on that. That's good.
Right.
Well, the ley line thing is.
Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to comment that ley lines has kind of become, in a lot of ways, it's a subject that's treated a lot like the giants, where people are sort of, it's almost as if everyone has their own definition of what ley lines are.
Right.
And I've got countless books on ley lines, and ley lines as a term, was invented in Britain, about 100 years ago, and it has changed its definition over time as a result of sort of a resurgence in popularity in the 1970s after John Michel's book, New View over Atlantis. But his version of what ley lines are, I would say, is largely an inspiration and an inspirational change versus what was thought of originally. Because originally the idea was that there were all these ancient sites across the landscape that were kind of lined up, and
It could be a stone circle in a church and a well and, a bunch of sacred places, that really didn't have a whole lot in common across time or space, different cultures built them and all kinds of things. And so what Michel said about them was, he had this vision that there were energetic lines, running across the landscape that people tuned into and built on these things. Now, whether that's true or not, nobody really knows for sure because nobody's really studied it in that fashion. I don't think. It's just it was sort of Michel's vision of what could be out there.
Right. That makes sense. Well, whenever you're, in other words, for me, like when I see a crop circle and you're registering all this energy coming out of it with the electromagnetics or whatever frequencies they're transmitting, obviously it's affecting multidimensional space, in my opinion. And so that's why I would associate with sometimes maybe some sort of imaginary line or an energetic signature, which could dovetail into something like the ley lines or perhaps something. That's what I was looking at. That's why I mentioned the parallels and different things like the 33rd parallel or something like that. But yeah.
Yeah. Well, if there is higher dimensional energies, and it's difficult to gather evidence in support of that. I might throw out an interesting observation that for people that are encountering the hurricanes these days might have something to ponder and think about. Back in the summer of 2004. There were 4 major hurricanes to hit the United States. Charlie, Francis, Ivan, and Jean were the 4 big hurricanes that year. And if you looked at the storm track of all 4 of those when they hit landfall in the continental U.S., you could just draw, kind of a line up into, the middle of North America along that where the storm track made landfall. All 4 of them pointed to one location. And that one location was Miamisburg, Ohio. Now, Jason knows what's in Miamisburg, Ohio, right? The big, famous Miamisburg Mound, which is one of the tallest conical mounds that was ever built in the United States. And literally in the closest field to that mound, as the remnants of Hurricane Francis made it all the way to Miamisburg, Ohio, if you can imagine, there was a major crop circle that happened in the closest field to that mound, and pretty much right in the crosshairs. Now you could say that perhaps the massive amounts of energy from those giant vortexes churning in the Earth's atmosphere may have perhaps primed, the energy to go up a parallel, perhaps, and all converge on that same point. That was a really interesting event that took place. It wasn't the only one. There was another, crop circle formation that happened in Raritan, Ohio, which is probably about 60, 70 miles away, along the same track. And so, whether or not that has much to do with it, a lot of people think that hurricanes might be multidimensional. Don't know.
Right. Well, I consider everything to be multidimensional to some degree, but that's just me. But that's fascinating. I didn't realize that. I've never heard that before. And I don't know if they actually talked about it in the news or not.
The Miamisburg crop circle made a couple of newspaper headlines, but I would say for the most part, most crop circles in the United States don't get a lot of media headlines.
Not at all.
That's very interesting because in the late 1800s, in a gravel pit in Miamisburg, Ohio, some people digging in a gravel pit found one of the largest skeletons ever found in North America. So it's fascinating.
Yeah. It's amazing what you find when you dig, right?
Now,
Jeff,
in terms of another multidimensional, aspect, possibility for crop circles, there was another major crop circle event in 2012 near another big Ohio earthwork called the Hopewell Earthworks, which was one of the largest earthwork enclosures ever built in the United States. And it appeared in the field adjacent to these earthworks outside of the town of Chillicothe, Ohio. It was one of the largest individual crop circle events that ever took place in the United States in a cornfield there. There were 43 circles and rings. And the way in which they're arranged, there were basically 7 sort of arms or little thought bubble designs all arranged. And that particular pattern was a fractal pattern. And it took me, the better part of a month or so looking at over 1,000 different fractals until I found a match for it. But that match is, you guys will love this term. It's that crop circle that appeared in that cornfield in Chillicothe, Ohio, back in September of 2012, was a 2-dimensional representation of a heptagonal hyperbolic planar tessellation.
Wow.
Okay. Now, that's a big term, but if we break it down, hepta is 7, so it's a 7-sided, that's the heptagonal part. The hyperbolic planar part refers to the projection. It's an infinite projection in another plane, and the tessellation meant that the pattern repeated. Now, there's only been one reference to this particular figure that I've ever come across, and that was in a pretty obscure mathematical journal called Fractals, which was edited by a physicist by the name of M.S.C, and he's an Egyptian physicist. And he wrote a paper back in the early 2000s talking about that this particular heptagonal hyperbolic planar tessellation, that structure, was the underpinning of the structure of the universe, according to an elementary particle physics theory, which describes the fractal model of quantum space-time, or E-infinity space. And it's related to phi, the golden ratio, which emerges from that theory. And it turns out to be sort of like the central piece that connects the fractal dimension of quantum space-time with the mass energy of the fundamental particles of our universe. And it happened to appear in, a field in Chillicothe next to an ancient earthwork.
Wow.
It's a really amazing structure and, very difficult to wrap your head around.
And you decoded that yourself?
Yeah, it was a lot of work.
I was going to say, you're brilliant. That's awesome. It's impressive.
Jeff Wilson is possibly the greatest researcher that I've ever personally met.
Mm-hmm.
So,
well, I know you're awesome too. There, Jason, I've interviewed you many, many times, and I know how intelligent you are. You're very thorough with your research as well, both of you. Yeah, it's a pleasure to have you on.
Well, the thing about this is that makes it really phenomenal. I think is that a lot of people just believe that all crop circles are man-made. I would bet that this particular design, in terms of, I would bet that less than 10 people in the world had ever heard of a heptagonal hyperbolic planar tessellation before this crop circle came down. And then I had to make the connection that, first of all, this pattern was a fractal, and then hunt down the actual fractal design that matched it. And there's, and then if somebody actually wrote about it, some physicist. I think that those are the kinds of things that, people just are generally unaware of, about the depth of complexity that crop circles have that, is just generally lost on most audiences.
Mm-hmm. It is. And what's interesting is most people who are into the crop circles, and from what I've seen, are really into the feeling about it. It's about what they feel when they interact with it versus you who actually are decoding it, which is very, very interesting.
Yeah, I think, part of it is the way in which people think about them. And it goes back to that sense that, are crop circles pre-paradigm, or are they beyond paradigm, or are they without a paradigm? One of the things that people don't generally recognize, I have this sort of, running joke with some of my friends in the UFO community that go out there and investigate, crop circles and UFOs. When they go out and investigate a UFO, generally they're running after, somebody that's seen it in the sky, and then they, they have to write down the report of the eyewitness report.
And Jeff,
but they don't really have any. Yeah.
We're heading for a break. I'm gonna have to break it right here. We'll be right back. Just everybody stay tuned. You're listening to Ravenstar's Witching Hour. I'm your host, Solaris BlueRaven. My wonderful guest tonight is Jeff Wilson. Of course, Jason Jarrell is co-host. We'll be right back. Stay tuned.